Introduction. Depending on who you listen to, guilt is either a necessary limiter to one's behavior or a severe, debilitating psychological problem. In the first case, we worry that if we don't feel any sense of guilt, we would be out of control with no moral sense. In fact, we often use terms like sociopath for someone who feels no guilt. On the other hand, we consider extremes of guilt to be a psychological problem, often rendering an individual unable to function normally in society. Such a person will seek judgment at every turn and may never believe there is a way to lead a normal life. We talk about the weight of guilt and how it pulls us down, how we're tied to those events in our past for which we judge ourselves harshly. Memories of painful experiences, and most importantly, our part in the creation of that pain, are present in everyone who lives in this world. If only and I should have are the mantras of the guilty person as one's life is re examined continuously. It seems as if only time can heal guilt in our lives, but often time simply covers it over with other events, and what was thought to be long past can resurface. But where does this guilt come from? In this book, we will look at guilt from many different angles, dissecting it into its component parts, and ultimately realizing how it is created. Once we recognize these mechanisms, we will discover a powerful answer to guilt. The rules of life. In most systems of thought, there exists a set of rules we are meant to live by. Whether these rules grow out of religion or philosophy, or are simply passed down through the generations, they represent the core beliefs with which we make decisions every day. We live with a set of rules in our minds which guide our behavior. Everyone's rules are a little different, so in some cases, we might judge someone else's behavior differently than we would judge ourselves. For instance, we might excuse a behavior in a child that we wouldn't excuse in ourselves. Though everyone carries these rules around with them, if asked to explain why we did something, sometimes we don't actually know and will even make up reasons that seem to make sense. We often feel guilty about actions we have taken without understanding why we did feels wrong. Ultimately, though, we will at some point along the way violate one or more of the rules in our minds, and the result will be feelings of guilt. These guilty feelings seem to have a real stickiness to them, often living in our minds throughout our whole lives. It appears the only way to eliminate guilt is not to violate the rules that would cause us to feel guilty. Oddly, though, no one ever seems to be able to completely avoid violating these rules. Even people we consider the saints, the gurus, the high priests all seem to have failings, leaving us mere mortals to despair of ever leading a guilt free life. A Course in Miracles. This book is based on a powerful system of thought called A Course in Miracles. Uh, the the course, as we will refer to it, was written during the years 1965 to 1972 and was first published in 1976. It consists of three parts: a text, a workbook for students, and a manual for teachers, all totaling over 1,000 pages. The text and the manual are to be read and studied, while the workbook consists of 365 daily lessons that provide a more direct experience and the application of the ideas from the text. The course was written by Helen Schuckman, a clinical psychologist who worked at several hospitals in New York. In describing how the course was created, she refers to herself as a scribe, writing what came to her at different times of the day, always in a fully conscious state. She was able to stop the scribing process whenever she wanted and immediately return to it when she was ready. The author of the course says he is Jesus, and it is written from the perspective of a teacher. For the purposes of this book, the process of the creation of the course is not important. What is important is the system of thought, the philosophy presented in the course. We will use that philosophy and apply it to our subject of guilt and see how the principles and concepts contained in that philosophy will first show us where our guilt truly comes from and then how we can free ourselves. The end of guilt. We will begin our discussions by defining guilt as precisely as we can, looking deep into its eyes and finding those mechanisms that create our guilt. We will look at examples from simple personal guilt to the weight of societal and moral guilt. Next, we will explore guilt from a historical perspective, looking at the ancient and modern religions which provide the moral rules for many people in our societies. We will look at how the great philosophers incorporated guilt and morality into their systems of thought. Finally, we will examine guilt from the point of view from modern psychology. With this background, we will see how the rules in our minds guide our everyday decisions and how by constantly violating those rules in ways, both great and small, we build our edifice of internal guilt. Once we understand guilt in all its aspects, we will introduce the philosophy of the Course. With this as our basis, we will re-examine guilt in a new light, discovering its illusory nature. Through the practice of forgiveness, we will see how we can free ourselves of each instance of guilt one at a time.
Thank you. Does anybody want to add a comment, or are there any questions, or are there any stories that you want to share? Great, let's go on to chapter 1. Finally, we're going to examine what it means to live a life without guilt and how it would look through the eyes of a guiltless person. How would such a person operate in the world? What would be the moral code that would guide them? What if everyone lived this way? And so let's begin the journey with from the pain of our lives to the end of guilt. Who'd like to start reading chapter 1?
I will.
Thank you.
If I'm understandable.
Yours.
What is guilt? I am. Okay, good. Before we can look at ways to eliminate guilt from our lives, we first need to define exactly what guilt is. For most people, guilty feelings are easily recognizable, though if asked to define guilt, they may be more likely to describe guilt in reference to a particular act than in the abstract. We will be looking for a broad general definition of guilt that will encompass the guilty feelings that most people experience, including others such as shame and regret. We are limited, though, by the use of words, which the Course refers to as symbols of symbols, thus twice removed from reality. We will use words to try and describe our experience, knowing the experience will always be beyond the words.
We just interrupted.
In common usage,
Irene?
the word guilt. Sure. Yep.
Yes, I just want to make sure that everybody knows that these references, for example, M-21.1 actually refers to the Course in Miracles. And that is actually in the Course in Miracles in the section called the Manual for Teachers, which is what M stands for. And 21 would be the section or the chapter in that Manual for Teachers, in that separate section of the book. And 1 would be the first paragraph of that section in that Manual for Teachers chapter. And there are other notations that come along. And so if anyone has any difficulties with the notations that you want to look further for them, since they're not linked here, that you could link to them, just remind me and I'll help you find any text if you need to find any text from the Course in Miracles that might be referenced here, okay? And let's continue.
In common usage, the word guilt actually has 2 different meanings. It can refer to a judgment imposed on someone by an outside agent, be it a legal religious organization or from another individual. Throughout history, all societies have had some concept of crime and punishment. In some cases, the guilt or innocence of an individual is determined by religious authorities, sometimes by appointed or elected judges, and sometimes by lay members of society. In all these cases, the judgment is externally applied. And if the judged individual is part of that society, he is expected to abide by these decisions. Even if the person being judged does not consciously feel guilty, he must deal with the externally decreed judgment of his guilt and accept the imposed punishment. If the judgment comes instead from an individual, we can have different reactions to this judgment. We could accept the judgment and feel guilty. We could reject the judgment and try to convince the other person they are wrong to judge us. Or we might simply ignore the judgment, feeling it was misguided in some way. Accept the judgment, then we are accepting the guilt that comes with it. The other meaning of guilt, and the one most important to this book, is the internal feeling of guilt for offenses we believe we have committed. In this case, there need not be an external judgment. We are judging ourselves based on our beliefs about the ethical and moral rules that govern our lives. The offense we believe we have committed may or may not rise to the level of a societal crime. Often in interpersonal relationships, we feel we may have treated someone poorly in an emotional way. These acts can lead to very deep-seated feelings of guilt, but may never be judged by an external agency or person. In this book, since we will ultimately be focused on the mind and changes in one's life through changes in mind, we will be primarily concerned with the internal sense of guilt. Later, we will actually see that due to the core principle of projection, as presented in the course, there really is no difference between the externally imposed judgments and the internally felt guilt. For now, though, we will focus on the second meaning, on our internal feelings of guilt and how we can define the word guilt in a useful way. We will then explore common examples of guilt in our everyday lives and look at how some other concepts like shame fit into our
Thank you.
definition.
Let me just interrupt you again. There's a distinction here between the internalization of guilt, the internal guilt, and the external judgment of guilt. So there's actually, in a sense, there's three ways to look at this, and the author introduced it as two, which is perfectly fine. So my internalized experience of guilt is what we're mostly going to focus on here. However, also guilt that is established as a judgment, whether it be by some other external governmental force or some other external judgment, still there may be an internalized version of that guilt. And that's, again, still the same version of guilt that we want to deal with in how the course is going to present itself. So the course is not really presenting itself as a way to reconcile judgments of guilt from an external source, just to make that clear. It only is really dealing with how, in fact, internally we can deal with and how internally we can escape from or end guilt in our lives. Anybody want to comment or share a?
Eric, I experienced that kind of dilemma when Derek Chauvin was found guilty, because I thought it was the right outcome, and yet I felt horrible for him despite what he did. And I thought, is this the best we can do as a society, is find people guilty and send them away for life? And yet I don't have any other answers. And so it's really not a question. It's just a comment I have that how do we rid ourselves of internal guilt if we are so hell-bent on finding people guilty of all sorts of things, even though societally we have to have something, I suppose. It's just, to me, it's a dilemma as humans that we have.
I'm glad you brought that up, because in fact, that's this dilemma still may remain in our minds. And that's where, in fact, we would need to deal with our own internalized difficulties with dealing with guilt. So that's a perfect example of how, in fact, it may seem to be an external judgment, and it might not even be about me or you that we're dealing with internally. We're dealing with it still anyway.
Yes, and so on some level, even though we might see the need for it and this and all that, does it somehow hurt us, harm us, harm our souls, harm our spirit, that we have to have it? Or
Yeah,
think that?
we're going to talk about that a little bit more as we go forward also in this book, about how that the effect of guilt is a mental harm, and the idea of that is what in fact makes it difficult to make progress in a peaceful resolution in our own mind about what it is we're struggling with.
Yes.
So we're certainly going to explore some of that. Another good point. Anybody else? Okay, let's go on to the section here now about the definition for guilt and how, in fact, that this is going to be developing here as we look at this, the difference, especially between the internalized and the external judgment of guilt, and also
I have one quick comment.
Good.
It's so guilt is like this primal concept that we draw out of ourselves, that this primal attachment that we draw out towards things that we see, and that we we attach ourselves to, and the release is to, I guess the course approaches itself with the release of guilt. The release.
yeah,
of
you're
that.
jumping ahead a little bit into the idea of, okay, so how do I stop the suffering? How do I stop the internal pain that's associated with this guilt, either that internalized or that I still am trying to process about, which happens out externally to me. So I still am processing guilt, and how could I go about processing guilt? It seems to involve a mental suffering. Am I able to see the release or the end of the mental suffering? And this is what the course is. This is what this book is going to exactly be about. Yes. So the end of mental suffering, it would be another way of saying the end of guilt.
I like Stefan's use, though, of the word attachment. That seems appropriate. Our attachment to guilt. Just a comment.
Yeah. And so it seems that you're also identifying with the fact of, it seems that there's something mysteriously attractive or mysteriously somehow difficult to escape about guilt in our minds.
Yes.
Yeah. Anybody else? Okay, let's go on then. Who would like to read about the definition for guilt? And
I'll read.
Thank you.
A definition of guilt. For our purposes, we want to use a broad definition of guilt, one which will include as many of the unpleasant inner feelings we experience. With this broad definition, it is hoped that one can see how so many of our everyday actions are driven by our internal guilt, or in many cases, just the anticipation of guilt. So we will use the following definition. Guilt is feeling bad because of something we believe we did wrong. In order for this to be a complete definition, we have to know what is meant by feeling bad and wrong. Here, feeling bad will include any feeling of discomfort, including emotional unease, a minor headache, extreme pain, severe depression, rage, worry, etc. Essentially, it is any feeling that is not loving toward oneself or another, which includes a very broad range. This idea of non-loving thoughts is one we will revisit later as part of our discussion about the course. This is a core principle of the course. If you are not having loving thoughts toward someone or toward yourself, you are experiencing an illusory thought, one you will be able to free yourself of through the practice of forgiveness. For now, simply assume that any emotional experience you have which is not centered on love is one that will be included in our sense of feeling bad. Think about how you are feeling towards someone, and if there is something other than love, caring, compassion toward that person, then you are having a bad feeling as referenced in our definition. We'll expand this concept further once we have explored the philosophy of the course.
So let me
That
just
covers the-
interrupt for a moment, Robin, because you brought up a very good point a little while ago about the outcome of the trial of Derek Chauvin, who was accused of and then found guilty of murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And so, in fact, when we saw the outcome of that, some people just cheered and some people jeered. And obviously, the whole world was not happy in the same way about that. And yet there seemed to be a celebratory sort of experience of that guilty verdict and the three guilty verdicts as it occurred. So it seems, in fact, that much of the world celebrated the fact that Derek Chauvin was found guilty. Now, there was also another extreme sort of reaction to that. And some people believe that, in fact, Derek couldn't have been guilty, that he, in fact, was only doing his police duty in restraining George Floyd, and that it was not his fault that George Floyd died. And they continue just to believe that, even though the court judgment that Derek is guilty. So that's the dilemma of it there, in terms of like, how do I deal with that? There's one dilemma. Now there's another dilemma also. Well, let me say, in fact, that I relate exactly to what you talked about, was that I see Derek was guilty of the murder of George Floyd. Not that he had maybe that intention in his mind, but that in fact his actions caused the death of Derek Floyd, and I can definitely see that. I also can see that Derek was in fact judged to be guilty, and so therefore there's a long-term punishment coming his way. And then further on beyond that, there are other cases that are going to be looked at in which there were complaints about Derek Chauvin as when he was a police officer. And so there may be further charges. And 3 more police officers also will be charged with aiding and abetting the murder, aiding and abetting Derek Chauvin. And so it's not over. And so it only amounts to a justice in terms of the judicial system, and yet it still seems to leave a dilemma as far as the way the world law looks at it. So when we experience that, how do we experience clearly what in fact is the course's perspective on that? And what the course is saying here is that if possible, I would want to have a release from guilt or anything related to it, which is any judgment, such as that there is a feeling bad about it. I would like to have the release of that. And in fact, I would like to have that replaced by love and caring and compassion towards that person. So obviously the course would advocate for the fact of that I would like to have love and caring and compassion towards Derek Chauvin. And also it would advocate that I would like to have love and caring and compassion replace any bad feelings about it, about those people that believe that Derek was innocent and that he did not kill George Floyd, and about the testimony also was given, which it seems like some of the testimony was given was false testimony, it seems, from the defense side of things. So there's a lot to consider there, isn't there? And there's a lot in terms of considering that makes it difficult for our human minds to keep along on the same progress of releasing ourselves from the suffering of bad feelings, what we're calling bad feelings, which more specifically is guilt and guilt-related type of feelings. Now, one thing that I found in another literature, which is from the 12 Steps Recovery Programs, I found that early on, Bill Wilson had identified this fact of that there's 2 sides of the same coin to deal with. One is called guilt in his estimation of it, and the other is called prideful self-will in his estimation of it. And it seems, in fact, that we might find ourselves sort of oscillating between the guilt and shame sort of side of that coin, or the prideful self-will side of that coin, and seem to somehow miss it about the humble and peaceful references in terms of how the Course would say this is the best way to deal with it is through love and caring and compassion. So I might miss, in fact, that was an option open to me. And in fact, it seems to me that most people might not be really conscious about this third option. The third option says that if I will release myself from the burden of myself, allow myself to receive the replacement of it, then it seems that the Course in Miracles is saying that my spiritual aspect of myself would be willing to supply love and caring and compassion towards those people or that person that had seemed to be at the center of these feelings of guilt. Or also conversely, if it were that I was having prideful self-will, an attack of self-righteousness or something along those lines, that perhaps I would see it more so is that also is suffering. And I would want a release from that and to be able to be returned to my spiritual way of seeing this through love and caring and compassion. So the Course is going to be offering us an entirely different perspective on things, a perspective that often is overlooked in the world. And I just thought it would be important to set that in here because the definition is very clear, I think, when we see that it isn't really just about bad feelings. It's also about the kind of way that we are processing judgment and processing guilt and processing self-will. And they're all related. And in fact, they're, in a sense, now that we see it this way, that we might begin to see it as they're all the same. They're all the same difficulty. Anybody?
Yeah, I did have a thought. Like, all right, so if when we're all one mind and there's so much aversion in a concept like that, the murder trial, like what happens when you like, does it just settle? Do you have to let it settle? How do you teach the healing? What's the healing process for so much aversion on a scale like that? I don't, I mean, I guess the Course would just say it's our part. I guess you already said it. The Course would say it's our part to just realize I am, that is me, and to show them love and 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 to just release the attachments.
Yeah, there seems to be a difficulty about that, though. In the question that you asked is a good question because it seems like there is about 8 billion fragments of that one mind. If I look at it as that there's one mind, if I look at all the human beings in the world and say that's all one mind or representative of one mind, that's pretty hard to see, isn't it?
Yeah, that would be like a
so
utopia.
Obviously the Course isn't talking about that as one mind. My image in my mind of that there are 8 billion fragments of one mind is probably not what the Course is really speaking about when we're talking about one mind.
Okay.
Eric, I want to talk to you about that later more in depth.
Great.
The one mind, what you just said.
Yeah.
Because I've been struggling with that as I study the Course, trying to understand one mind.
Sure.
So I won't take the time here.
Who would like, I'm sorry, did somebody else want to read or did you want to continue, Robin?
I'm happy to continue. I think we are at the word that covers the first part of our definition.
Yep, good.
So now let's look at the second part. Defining wrong is a bit more difficult because our definition of guilt includes the word believe. Therefore, what is wrong is what a person believes to be wrong, which can differ greatly from person to person. This means that each individual will have a different set of beliefs on which to decide if an action is wrong or not. For example, most people would say that they believe that killing is wrong, but if pressed further, you would find that it makes a difference what kind of killing you're talking about. Though most everyone would say cold-blooded murder is wrong, there are many who believe killing in self-defense or defense of one's loved ones or one's country is not wrong. Most believe that killing insects or other pests is okay, but some consider this to be wrong. Then is killing an ant purposefully and doing it accidentally equally wrong? These rules and beliefs may seem to have come from outside us, perhaps from our church or our parents, but they are only active within our minds when we make them our own. Different individuals hearing the same sermon or lecture from some religious or other authority will decide in their own individual way whether to accept those rules. Once a rule is accepted, it can be used to determine whether our actions are right or wrong. The important point here is that it is impossible to find a universal meaning of what people believe is wrong. Everyone has a different set of beliefs and rules in their minds that define for them what is wrong. In a later chapter, we will explore in greater depth how we each build our internal rules, those rules through which we will decide the rightness or wrongness of our actions.
This is going to go on now to give several different examples, like sort of almost case studies about examples of guilt. And I would recommend that we probably just go on through some of these examples before we take a break and talk more about how we process guilt if we want to do that. Or if anybody feels that you really need to speak about that, go ahead. Okay, let's look at the examples then. Who would like to read?
Examples of guilt. So back to our definition. The feeling of guilt is an unpleasant feeling, one that is not loving, that exists because we believe we have done something wrong, where that something wrong is ultimately defined by our own internal beliefs. Now we will look at some examples of internal guilt and see how our definition fits those examples. Example 1. After losing her job, Sarah goes over to see her sister Joan to ask her for some money to tide her over until she can find a new job. Joan flatly refuses, telling Sarah she has always been a loser. Hearing this criticism, which she's heard many times before, something snaps in Sarah, and she begins screaming at Joan, throwing things around the room, and then runs out of the house. Later, as she thinks about what she did, Sarah feels terrible, thinking that if only she were more successful, Joan wouldn't have been put in a situation where she had to refuse her. Here, Sarah has a long history with her sister, a relationship in which she feels inferior to her. In this scenario, the years of being put in that inferior position lead her to lash out. At the same time, she loves her sister and knows she has crossed a line in their relationship. She feels bad both because she believes her sister may be right and because she knows her behavior was inappropriate. She has violated her internal rule of always being loving toward her family, no matter what the situation, and also the rule of keeping her emotions under control. Example 2. Michael and Amy have been married for several years when over time their communication seems to break down. Feeling lonely, Michael begins a brief affair with a colleague at work. They meet after work some evenings, and when Amy ultimately asks him why he's out so many nights, he lies to her, telling her he has a new project at work that demands extra time. He knows the affair is wrong, but he also feels a deeper sense of guilt because he is lying to someone he loves. Though he may feel there are reasons for the affair, Michael can't really justify it to himself. His internal rules about marital behavior have clearly been violated. He feels a deeper guilt for lying to his wife, which violates not only marital rules, but also his sense of proper behavior towards someone he cares about. Example 3. David is the only child of a mother who has cancer and is slowly dying. He's married with 3 teenage children, a demanding job, and struggles financially. He doesn't believe he can adequately take care of his mother, and he doesn't want his wife to be burdened with her care. He decides to place his mother in a nursing home where she is unhappy and where she ultimately dies. He knows he should have done more to make her last years good ones. He can rationalize that having a difficult job and being a husband and father takes all of his time and energy, and there was nothing else he could do about his mother. On the other hand, he also knows that his mother made many sacrifices throughout his life so he could grow up to be the man he is today. Realizing this, David feels he really should have sacrificed something in his life to create the time to be with his mother when she needed him. Her death means he can never resolve this with his mother, and he may carry this guilt for the rest of his life. Example 4. Melissa goes out to celebrate her 21st birthday with friends. She knows they have all had too much to drink, but when her friend Susan asks her to drive home, she doesn't feel she can refuse her. On the way home, the car goes off the road and hits a tree, and Susan is killed. Melissa is later charged with manslaughter. Here, a simple and at the time seemingly harmless decision is made that ends up wrecking many lives. Melissa has violated the basic tenets of her religious beliefs as well as the laws of her society. She not only must deal with her internal guilt, but also with guilt imposed by Susan's family, the community at large, and the legal system. Whether she goes to prison or not, she will be imprisoned by her guilt, knowing she has taken the life of someone she cared about. Though the decision seems simple at the time, it may have lifelong debilitating consequences. We will revisit these examples later in the book to see how we can apply the concepts of the course. We will look at the ultimate source of the guilt in all these cases, as well as ways it can be released.
Great. Let's just pause here then, and let me say these different examples of how that guilt presents a dilemma seem to be there's a continuance of the processing of the difficulty, even though there seems to have been a at least temporary resolution to whatever that problem was. So the problem is in the past, yet the conditioning of it and the processing of it is in the present, seemingly taking from our minds the connection that we have to the present. Teresa, I see you raised your hand because it told me that on the
Yeah. I was just going to say, doesn't the course tell us that everything happens for our own good? And I mean, is guilt for our own good? I don't know. Maybe I don't understand that part. And then it says, take responsibility for what happens because we ask for these things. So I'm paraphrasing. I don't know.
Yeah. Okay. I'm following you. That's fine. And I'll explain a little bit about what you said because it's a good point. So the course does tell us, in fact, that everything can be used as a means to the proper end. In fact, the course gives us a system or a process for finding our way through this and other difficulties as we find that everything is a means towards the right end, if in fact we know what the right end is. So the course, in fact, is telling us that all of the past separation ideas, including guilt and including willful self-pride and everything in between, is all being undone. Where it's being undone in, it seems to be unclear oftentimes to people. And that's in this mind that we're referring to, which is not human, which is not a part of the world outside ourselves, which in fact seems to, however, believe that it is a part of the world outside ourselves. So how is this illusory nature of the world seemingly taking place in our mind such that we're not clear that in fact isn't real at the time, is that this version of the past has always left us with a dilemma about what to do in the present. Our past is always seemingly leaving us with residue that needs to be resolved in some way, shape, or form. And only can we do it because we believe that there is always a way, shape, or form for us to deal with it. It puts us in direct opposition, therefore, in terms of how that our spirit would be able to deal with the situation that is illusory. It would simply not pay any attention to anything that's illusory. It only would pay attention to what's true and what's real. So this is going to be, sort of a little bit of a mystery for the time being, perhaps, but there seems to be a version of truth, a version of reality, and a version of the mind, it seems, that we must be sort of elevated to, that we must be sort of in a vertical alignment with, in order for us to be able to process the truth instead of processing what's untrue. So here we see these different examples. All of them left us with a dilemma explained here as to what was in the mind of the person that was suffering from that dilemma. I think we probably all did relate to at least one or two of those stories and see clearly that the issue of the dilemma in that person's mind is not something that's easy to resolve with the human mind, and that there may be a continuation of that process of trying to deal with that difficulty. I'll just let you know, Irene has a bad connection oftentimes. And so if she disappears also, it's the same thing as my problem. She just got dropped probably. So, Teresa, back to your question and or your comments. How do you feel about that now?
Yeah, I mean, I understand that. I have to, for the last example there, the woman that, the 21-year-old who wrecked the car and killed her friend. I mean, I cannot imagine the tremendous guilt, and what it says here, the lifelong debilitating consequences of that. And I mean, chances are she'll probably go to prison. She'll have the punishment and all that. And, I guess, in her mind, she can continue to choose the guilt, the ego. What did Marianne Williams say? Guilt is the ego's orgasm, and she could continue.
I never heard that. No.
You never heard that?
I listen to her sometimes. I never heard it though. Yeah.
Yeah. And, she can continue to choose that and feed the ego, or she can, listen to the Holy Spirit and see if she can help others. Because if she's going to prison, I'm sure there's other people in there with the same situation that she might be able to help. So I don't know if that's, what they're talking about. I mean, everything that happens to me, is basically, for my own good. If I don't see it that way.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And you just made a link also though to a better future.
Right.
In minds of Susan, who has now been, charged with vehicular homicide. I assume that's what they charged her with. But anyway, she's having to deal with the fact that her best friend died from a car accident in which she was inebriated and she shouldn't have been driving either. And the court cases and the family issues and so on and so on and so on. But you just jumped that into the future for a better future for her to take a look at in her life, her perhaps going to prison, which sounds pretty bad, but her being able to meet people in prison who are suffering from the same problem and perhaps being helpful to those in prison that she meets. So there's a link to something that I mentioned earlier before. I probably would have to have a sense of continuing love and compassion and caring about others to be helpful, if that's what in fact I decided that would be better for me. So I think you're hinting at a solution that we're going to start to see unfolding here, is that if I can't seem to resolve the past, perhaps indeed I need to live with a lesson of the past in such a way as that I still can be released from the suffering of the past. So as you kind of were putting it, everything can be used for the good, if that was its intention. Mm-hmm. So how do I process it that must be the intention then of spirit. So I may need help for that. I think maybe we see it as only Susan can help herself, but of course there are other people in Susan's life also that are going through this dilemma along with her in a sense, even though they maybe not have been in the car, but they're still in her life. And so all of those relationships also will be a part of Susan's recovery from what happened. And the other people also have other people in their lives too. The man who's having an affair, and another, dilemma. Apparently he still loves his wife, according to the story here. So, and I don't think that's unusual. I think people that have affairs often still love their partners.
They had a communication breakdown.
A major communication breakdown. Sure. Yeah. Right. Exactly. What is a relationship really? What's based
It's a long series of miscommunication.
Or yeah.
I'm teasing.
Useful, helpful, good communication, or perhaps not, perhaps bad communication, miscommunication, perhaps.
Yeah, maybe unloving. He said he was feeling lonely,
Mm-hmm. So there's a good sign there that he probably was having a problem with communication in his marriage.
So, Eric, could I ask a question now? Is it, if Teresa's finished? So regarding wrong, and I get this is where judgment and then therefore seeing others external guilty, but regarding wrong, not it, it's wrong if you believe it. If your belief system is such that it's wrong, and I get that, but how are we going to deal with absolving ourselves of guilt when we have a really egregious belief system? And I'll give an extreme example. Some of the people who showed up at January 6th to storm the Capitol had on t-shirts that said 6 million wasn't enough. And they mean 6 million Jews in the Holocaust were not enough killed. That's a really egregious belief system, I would think, by nearly everybody's, except they believe it. And so they get to say, so I'm not guilty because that's my belief system. And I don't know how the book's going to deal with that. Not all
it's going to be something that we're going to internalize, perhaps, and that's where we're going to see if we can deal with it. You know, so the challenge here is you're allowing yourself to go along here in learning about this, so you can see, can you deal with what you've internalized?
Mm-hmm.
Right. Right. Yeah, I do internalize.
Hmm.
I do. I do, because then I feel guilty for kind of hating these people.
Okay.
So maybe that's what we're going to deal with here.
Well, we're going to deal with certainly the part about how we internalize the conditioning and the dilemma and the difficulties of suffering from guilt, how it's internalized. Certainly, we're going to look at that for sure. We may also be helped with the fact of a process that works for us to help to reduce this miscommunicating about how it is we're supposed to deal with guilt when it has to do with judgment, and is externalized in terms of the laws and in terms of the customs and beliefs and so on and so forth that has to do with the world outside ourselves. We may or may not find that these two things become one. We may or may not see that for a while. And eventually we will begin to see the non-duality of it as that this is one problem of judgment, and this one problem of judgment is only internalized in terms of how it can do damage, such that my mind believes, in fact, that there's harm that I need to be protected from. And this triggered mechanism sort of thing of how I feel that I need to be protected is where it becomes dangerous in my mind, where my mind begins to not be able to sort out the dilemma of it.
Right. Yes, I do hang on to the duality because of it, for sure.
Sure.
I mean, I don't
Well,
want
you're
to.
not the only one, so
Okay.
don't feel alone.
I don't feel alone, but I don't feel good about it either. Okay, thanks.
I think there is a way that certainly the course and this book are going to present us a way that may work.
I hope. Good.
As an individual, though, we'll have to go through the process here to see how, in fact, it is working for us.
Right.
So if you'll stick with it, I think you'll see there is a method here that works.
I had a quick comment. It seems like guilt comes from like my actions tied to like doing something that has is tied to it has a bad stigma attached to it. And but like Robin was saying, like, how do I heal myself of that if I don't know like it's bad? Like
Okay.
what, you know, like,
Right.
Yeah, like those people that have the 6 million people T-shirts.
yeah,
on the-
but even
that's-
beyond that, but like once you're beyond that, once you're doing the course and you're beyond certain material illusions,
Uh-huh.
like like how do you maintain how do you keep yourself grounded in the course and maintain?
Another good question. In fact, it's going to be something that also is going to be talked about here. And the processing of this in terms of being able to process what is the difference between innocence and guilt is going to become a little bit more clear to us. So innocence is going to have to do with this internalized process. This internalized process perhaps will replace these other ideas that have to do with beliefs about how things work because they're defined and conditioned in the world outside ourselves as that they work a certain way. Perhaps we're going to see that they don't have to work that way in our mind. We're going to see that there's a difference between our one mind, which you mentioned earlier, and this 8 billion minds.
All right, thank you.
We have about 15 minutes left for the time on this. And since our discussion has been pretty good so far with a lot of different points that were made, I'm just going to finish up with this similar concepts and stop here once we get into the actual different other concepts. So some concepts are going to be mentioned here that are related to guilt, but we'll pick up next time with that, and we'll actually start here with similar concepts or someplace here that makes sense with a short little story about what we did so far. So there are similar concepts, and concepts is going to be something that as we begin to discover how, in fact, things really work in the mind that's at peace, in inner calm and inner joy, we're going to see, in fact, that concepts are not part of that mind. We're going to see that, in fact, that the right mind, or the mind that's been that has escaped from guilt or has found the end of guilt, is not a mind that suffers for the need of any concepts. In fact, that mind is freed of concepts as well as freed of guilt. So it's going to take a while, but we're going to see that it's going to happen in our mind. We'll be able to see it happen, and then perhaps we'll be able to see how we can extend that into the future instead of how we can repeat the past and the difficulties of the past and the dilemmas of the past. Perhaps we'll see that there's a different way that we can process things altogether with a process that works and therefore eliminates the need to suffer any dilemmas for any specific or any length of time. Not that we won't notice it, and not that we won't, in fact, have a reaction to it that's similar to grief or to suffering in some kind, or anger even, but we'll have a process that works, which we can see sort of helps us escape from that. And in the escape from that, though, it's an escape into compassion, into love, into caring and kindness, and being helpful to others. So it's not an escape such that we become irresponsible and not responsible for what we see and what the needs of the world are, but an escape that allows us, in fact, to remain helpful and to use our principles rather than these concepts that have been taught and that we see relevant in the world, especially because of the system of the fragmented. It's not just fragmented 8 billion people, but it's fragmented in terms of how we live also. All different cultures and even subcultures within those cultures makes it even more difficult for us to see a resolution to all this in the world outside ourselves. So that might not be the point, really, of studying A Course in Miracles or of studying how to escape from guilt. The point of it might not be that we have to experience the world outside ourselves as that there's any need for us to do anything about the world outside ourselves, but in fact that we can allow ourselves to see that even without a motivation or need to do something about what's wrong in the world, that we can still, in fact, live very peacefully and very comfortably and very lovingly with others in the world, even though they may see it as that it's always full of dilemmas and there's an absence of peace and an absence of joy and an absence of love, perhaps, in their mind. We may not have to suffer from that, and therefore we may see that we're even elevated to a higher level of being able to be helpful to others. So similar concepts, those who explored different cultures in the world discover there are many words used to describe the guilt and shame we all experience. In Asian cultures, there is more emphasis on the concept of shame, and there are often multiple words used to describe the different types of shame. In Western culture, especially Catholic and Jewish traditions, the emphasis is on guilt and how guilt can lead one to an examination of one's own behaviors. It is hoped that through this examination, a person can understand what wrong actions were taken and thereby change the behavior that brought about the guilty feelings. Modern psychologists have tried to show how guilt, shame, regret, embarrassment, and similar feelings are all different and should be treated differently. We will take the opposite approach and conclude that these are all different aspects of the same feeling and the same problem, and we will lump them all together under the term guilt. So we're going to let the term guilt become an umbrella sort of definition that has to do with our beliefs and our interpretations and these dilemmas that we find that our mind is stumped by or bewildered by. And we're going to pick it up next time with talking about a more generalistic approach. I'm going to turn off the screen share. And so the recording is still on, just to remind you, and I'm going to turn off the screen share. I'm also going to turn off the recording once I do that. And we'll just have a few more minutes that we can share if we want to without recording.
I was thinking about what you said about the outer